Today, I'm going to be showing you the best build in Diablo 4 for the Necromancer. Now, this build is possible after patch 1.1.1, which goes live today, August 8th. Now, I'm going to show you and tell you why this build is the best in the entire game, but first, let me show you how to actually build it for yourself. Now, for this, I have created a build guide that is super easy to follow. Now, if you've seen one of my other previous build guides, I used a different build guide. I used a site called Mobilytics. Now, personally, I just have not been a fan of Mobilytics lately. They've had a lot of problems, a lot of errors, not displaying the right stats, stuff like that. And so I made the decision over here to switch to d4builds.gg. I think it's just better. It displays the correct stats, it has the correct Paragon points. Everything is just works with this. Much easier, much simpler. And of course, the link will be in the description and in the top comment down below. Now, as we get started here, we are going to spend 3 points in Reap, and then Enhanced Reap, and then Acolyte's Reap. And the reason is we're actually going to use Reap quite a lot. We're going to use it at the start of the fight to make a corpse so that our corpse explosion can go off. Now, moving down here to Blight, we're going to put points in Blight, into Enhanced Blight, and Paranormal Blight. Now, we do have Blight 4 out of 5. That's just because we didn't have an extra skill point to max it 5 out of 5. The reason we went with Blight here over Sever is because this build is really spec'd for damage over time, and Blight gives us another source of damage over time. Now, of course, we're going to put 3 points in Huge Flesh for just create some extra corpses. And then, of course, we max out Blood Mist 5 out of 5 with Enhanced and then Ghastly. And the reason we do this is to reduce the cooldown of Blood Mist so that we can have it up as often as possible, because when you're in it, you're completely invincible. You take absolutely 0 damage from all instances. So if we can have this up for the max amount of time, that's better for us in the long run. It's going to make us more survivable, able to do higher tier dungeons, and create more corpses. Now, of course, we're using Corpse Explosion with Enhanced and then Blighted, and then forced 1 point in Grim Harvest and 3 out of 3 in Fueled by Death. Now, as we move down here, 3 out of 3 in Death's Embrace, just making sure that we do more damage and take less damage from enemies that are close to us. Then, of course, 12% increased damage to cursed enemies, which we're going to be cursing all enemies. This is great. Now, we put 1 point in Decrepify, Enhanced Decrepify, and Abhorrent. Basically just reduce cooldowns by 1 second. That's going to be super helpful to make sure our Blood Mist and our Bone Storm are up as often as possible. Now, as you might have noticed, we have points in Decrepify, but the Decrepify skill is not actually going to be on our bar. Now, the reason is because one of the Caged Hearts that we're using casts an aura of Decrepify around us, meaning that we don't have to have this on our bar for it to work. So we'll still get the bonuses for having these points, but we don't actually have to cast it, which is super nice. Now, of course, Corpse Tendrils down here with Enhanced and then Plague to make enemies vulnerable, and then a bunch of points into our Shadow passives. Now, 1 point into Reaper's Pursuit just to get into the whole tree, 3 out of 3 in Gloom for max damage, and 3 out of 3 for Terror for max damage. Now, I do have 1 point in Crippling Darkness just for a 15% chance to stun. It can be really nice just to stun everybody. You could take this point out if you want it and spend it somewhere else, maybe max out 5 out of 5 Blight or put it in some other passive. Now, of course, we did have 3 out of 3 in Necrotic Carapace. Basically just means we're going to fortify for 4% of our base life every time a corpse is formed, which we form a lot of corpses. So that's a lot of fortify, makes us super tanky. Now, as we move down here, we're going to be looking at first at standalone. It's basically going to give us damage reduction for not having minions, and then Memento Mori, basically increasing the bonus from sacrificing our mages and our skeletal warriors. Now, of course, we are going to be using Bone Storm with it maxed out all the way to Supreme. And then, of course, we are going to be using Shadow Blight. Now, I have tweaked this tree a lot, and so far this has been by far the best combination that I have found. Of course, the optional ones are Crippling Darkness right here. You could take this point out, and you technically could take the 3 points out of Decrepify. I prefer not to, as it is super helpful to have this cooldown reduction, but you could take it out of it and put it in something like Iron Maiden, and then you'd be double cursing, which if you do a little bit of tweaks, that could lead to a little bit more damage. I just prefer it this way, super helpful, and it's super easy to keep really high uptime on all of your cooldowns. Now, next, let's take a quick look at the gear needed for this build. Now, first, we're going to be looking at the helmet, which we're going to be using the Aspect of Explosive Mist. Now, basically, when we are in our Blood Mist, it is going to cause corpse explosions to go off at surrounding corpses, and when it's going to do this, it is going to actually reduce the cooldown for our Blood Mist. Make sure that we have Blood Mist more and more often, and overall is a super strong build. Now, as we go into the stats for the gear, we do want Lucky Hit Chance while you have a barrier. As with Blood Mist and Fortify, we're going to have a barrier decently often in this build. Now we do want some cooldown reduction, intelligence, and max life to round off our helmet. Now as we move down here to our chest piece, we're going to build in some more survivability. Damaging an elite grants a barrier absorbing X amount of damage for 10 seconds. This can happen once every 30 seconds. Now with this build, we're going to be damaging elites a lot, as we're basically going to be able just to run through every other enemy in the game. Damage reduction from close enemies is going to be great, as we'll always be close. Damage reduction from affected by shadow damage over time enemies. This should be theoretically every single enemy in the game, so this is another great one for us. And of course, shadow damage and total armor. Now as we move down to the one unique in the build is the Howl from Below. Now I really like these gloves, and the reason is when we are spawning corpse explosions, is going to summon a volatile skeleton that charges and explodes a corpse explosion at the target's location. It does increase the corpse explosion's damage, and not only that, it just makes sure that if you're fighting, people at range and you're blowing up corpse explosions, the skeletons are actually going to find the people at range, maybe the archers, the ghosts, the ghouls, and it's going to kill them even at range. I think this makes the build far better. It gives you a ton more damage, and overall is super nice to have. Now, as we move on down to the pants, we have the aspect of Shielding Storm, basically giving us a barrier every time we use Bone Storm. It is a super strong barrier, really easy to use, and it makes you very survivable. Now, down at the boots, we are using the Ghost Walker aspect. While unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% increased movement speed and can move freely through enemies. Now, what counts as unstoppable? Well, a lot of our build actually makes us unstoppable, including Blood Mist, which is the big one. And now for perks, we do want some more movement speed, ranks of corpse tendrils, intelligence, and all stats. This is just going to give us a ton of movement speed in this build, which Necromancers desperately need. Now in the weapon slot, we are going to be using a two-handed weapon, so we don't have to worry about the offhand slot in this build. We're going to be using a two-handed scythe for health regeneration after a kill. So basically in the blighted aspect, we're going to deal 15 to 120% increased damage for 6 seconds after the Shadow Blight key passive damages enemies 10 times. So basically with the Shadow Blight key passive, it's going to be constantly ticking since we're constantly doing shadow damage, and this is just going to be a huge DPS boost, pretty much up constantly. And now we do want some critical strike damage, intelligence, damage to close enemies, and damage to affected by shadow damage over time enemies. This is just going to make our build super strong. Now moving on into the Amulet, we have the aspect of Grasping Reins, which is basically going to make us do increased critical strike chance and deal bonus critical strike damage after enemies are damaged by corpse tendrils, which corpse tendrils is being automatically cast thanks to the cage heart we're using. So this is a really strong bonus damage multiplier for us. Then we have the Blood Soaked aspect. Blood Mist leaves behind a trail that lasts for 4 seconds and deals X amount of shadow damage per second to enemies who stand in it. Your movement speed is no longer reduced while Blood Mist is active, again giving us a bonus to our movement speed and doing a little bit extra shadow damage while we're in Blood Mist. This is huge, as we're going to have Blood Mist up all of the time. And then we have the aspect of Decay. Each time the Shadow Blight key passive deals damage to enemies, it increases the next Shadow Blight's damage within 10 seconds by 25 to 45%, stacking up to 5 times. Now the aspect of Decay is super strong, and it's actually getting a buff today in patch 1.1.1. So it's even better now. So damage to affected enemies as shadow over time enemies, great perk. Damage to close enemies, damage over time, and shadow damage. Basically, when you are build crafting and trying to get the best gear, you just want to get as much critical strike damage, damage to affected shadow damage over time enemies, and just straight shadow damage. That is what you're going to be going for on these damage pieces. You can see they're all pretty much just, buffing our damage to close, shadow damage, shadow damage over time, and everything like that. We're just trying to pump out the max amount of damage possible in this build. Now next, let's take a quick look at the hearts that we are using. Start off with the Sacrilegious. This is going to automatically cast corpse skills when you are near a corpse, dealing 30 to 20% reduced damage. But with our Howl from Below, this is pretty much canceled out, at least for our corpse explosions, and this is super nice, basically making it so that you are only using 4 buttons in this build. It is super nice to have, and I absolutely love this heart. And moving on, we have the Decrepit Aura. Now what this does is when people are near you, they're going to automatically be decrepified by the curse, and that's why we had points in it in the skill tree. Now there are different roles of this. You ideally want to get one that has 0 enemies near you for it to activate, but a 1 enemy near you will also work to get a full Uptime Decrepit aura. Now in this build, we are using the Barber. Now I debated for a long time whether to use the Barber or not, as there is another Wrathful Heart that actually deals with damage over time, and I tested it a lot, and sadly the Barber is just too strong not to use. The other Wrathful Heart just didn't nearly do the amount of damage that the Barber did. I wish I didn't have to use the Barber in this build. I'm kind of getting sick of using the Barber for this whole season, but it's just too strong not to use. This is what's allowing us to do crazy damage, to kill bosses in one hit, and it's honestly super, super strong. Now a quick note with the different roles of the Barber. Now for bosses, the longer cooldown, so basically the 4 seconds that is absorbed, is better for bosses. Lower is better for running through ads because you won't be doing, no damage for as long. If you want to get a medium roll around 3, that's what I would recommend. Or you can have 2 rings, one with a 2 second and one with a 4 second if you're really trying to optimize. Now for our gems, we are going to put emerald gems in our weapon for critical strike damage and ruby gems in our armor for maximum life. As you can see, this is how I have the skills laid out. So Blood Mist, Bone Storm, Reap, Blight, Corpse Tendril, and Corpse Explosion. We do not have Decrepify on the bar anywhere. Now next, looking at our Skeletal Warriors and our book, here we are sacrificing our Reapers for 10% increased shadow damage, sacrificing our Cold Skeletons for increased damage against vulnerable enemies, and sacrificing our Iron Golem for critical strike damage. Now if you scroll in here, you can see all of the different rolls on the pants. This is going to be the best ones that you can get, and of course this will be linked down below. Now finally, I do want to take a quick look at the Paragon. We're going to go pretty fast through this as we still have a lot to cover. So for starting off in the starting board, we're going to start off with Territorial, basically just doing more damage to close enemies, which thanks to the Sacrilegious Heart, everything should be close thanks to our Corpse Tendrils. Now as we move up onto the Wither board, which is also getting a buff in patch 1.1.1, we are going to be using the Darkness rare glyph, basically just meaning that we're going to be doing increased shadow damage. Now we're going to connect that with the Flesh Eater board, basically giving us bonus damage for using corpses, which we are doing constantly. And we're going to be throwing in Essence, basically more critical strike damage to enemies that are not healthy. And this is super, super strong. Now we're going to be connecting that with the Scent of Death, and basically damage reduction when all the corpses are used up. As we're constantly popping corpses, we're going to be getting this damage reduction. Now we're going to connect this with the Control glyph. Basically, we're doing more damage to slowed or chilled enemies, and this is going to happen all the time because the Decrepify aura slows enemies. Now finally, we are going to be moving into the Bone Graft board. We're not going to be worrying about the legendary perk, and we're just going to be going over into the Amplify, basically just giving a nice bonus to the cursed enemies. Everyone should be cursed in this build. So this should just be a straight nice little damage buff. Now finally, to wrap up the actual guide, I want to talk about what you should do when you're fighting an enemy. So the ideal scenario is that you run into a group, you cast Reap 1 time, and this is going to spawn a corpse. Now if you haven't spawned a corpse, the first thing that's going to happen is Corpse Tendrils is going to cast thanks to the Sacrilegious, as the Sacrilegious has a casting order. It will first try and cast Corpse Tendrils, and then once it's on cooldown, it will cast Corpse Explosion. Now, the Sacrilegious has its own cooldown system, not like different from the cooldown in the game. So it's not an 11-second cooldown. It is different. So that's how it's going to work. You get 1 corpse, it's going to spawn the Corpse Tendrils, and then you're ready to rock and roll. Now, what I found to do the absolute crazy amounts of damage is you Reap first, get your Corpse Tendrils, place 2 Blights down. So just hit your Blight twice at the huge group. Then you go into Bone Storm, and then you go into Blood Mist. This is just going to absolutely stack all of our damage over time on top of them and just do absolutely crazy damage combined with the Barber. You're going to crit, absorb all that damage, and then you're going to see hits in the tens to hundreds of millions. This is incredibly strong. That's what I would like to do. And as you're moving through Nightmare Dungeons, if you're trying to speedrun them, you're pretty much going to use Blood Mist, off cooldown back to back as you're going between groups, and the same with Bone Storm. Thanks to all of our cooldown reductions, you're going to have these very, very often. The optimal rotation for bosses is the one I showed you earlier, and that's what I would kind of do. When you get a chance, throw some Blights at some groups' enemies, use Reap when you need to make some corpses, and other than that, just stay in your Blood Mist, keep using Bone Storm, and you're going to absolutely see insane damage numbers from every aspect of this build. Now, I am super happy with it, and now let's finally get on to why this build is the best build in Diablo 4. Now, finally, we are to the point that many of you have been waiting for. Why is this build the best? Why these skills? Why is it not a Bone Spear build? Why is it not a, straight Infinimus build? And this is close to the Infinimus build, but it's just more fun. And really, when it comes down to the best build in Diablo 4 for me, it had to be fun. And it has to do insane damage. And there are builds out there, some that I've showcased, that do the insane damage, but they just aren't fun in the long term. And the skeletons in all of these summons, for instance, they are a blast until you get to about level 70. And once you get to level 70, the skeletons in all of the summons just felt more of a hassle to play with than they were worth. You know, they can be really strong and they do a ton of damage against bosses. But in a dungeon and with the, you know, the different elite mobs being able to one-shot them, they're just kind of annoying to play with. And overall, I wanted to make a build that didn't use any minions. Now, one of the reasons I think this build is the best is this is the most fun playing a Necromancer that I've had this entire season. And that's honestly the biggest metric for me, is how fun a build is. Because yes, all of the top builds do insane damage and can clear any content in the game. But if they're boring to play, you're never going to get to that content. And so what I tried to create is a fun build that stacks all of this damage over time, does a ton of shadow damage. All of it's even getting buffed today. So all of the footage you're seeing in the background and, you know, that's playing right now, this was before patch 1.1.1. So this build is actually even stronger today. And it's just super, super fun. Overall, I think it is a extremely strong build. You know, you're still going to be one-shotting bosses. You're still going to be absolutely destroying entire dungeons like it's nothing, you know, playing 20 to 30 levels higher than you with no problems. Now, that is why I think this build is the best build in Diablo right now. It is fun. And that, like I said, is the most important thing for me. I don't find Bone Spear fun, and I don't find a straight Infinimus build fun. I just don't think they're that fun to play. This really, I just like shadow damage. I have since the start of the game, and that's why I created this build. I think it is a blast, and I do honestly think this build is the best. So with that, thank you everybody for watching if you made it to the end of the video. Now, if you want to help me out here on YouTube, make sure to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you guys in a future video. Thank you. Peace out.